So to start this video off, I'm going to be cutting down all the lumber to make the 4 bases, the 2 upper bases and the 2 bottom bases. This is all 1/4 inch red oak veneer ply. This stuff got very expensive during COVID and it has stayed expensive. So at a lot of parts you'll see that I piece things together. That saved about $300 worth of materials piecing stuff together versus buying whole sheets to not have seams. There's a couple spots where I wish I hadn't done that, and you'll see a little later what I'm talking about. But this is pretty wide, it's over 4 feet, so I had problems with cutting stuff like this on my tools. The radial arm saw will leave tear out marks on this. So in order to cut this first piece, what I did was I scored it with a handsaw so I didn't have to worry about any tear out, and then I could go through and final cut it. This was a little bit of a process, but if I cut this with certain power tools, unless you have really new blades with extremely sharp teeth and multiple tooth blades, 60 or 80 teeth, this veneer is so thin it has a tendency to tear a lot. Blue tape will help alleviate that, but for a project like this it was just easy enough to hand saw a couple pieces. So this is starting on the bottom. I have to work around the legs, so you'll see I have pencil marks for those legs, and then I could just mark with a square the parts I have to cut out. So a couple of these legs were a little twisted. The one on this side was the leg that I showed in the first video that had the rough sawn parts, so I didn't cut too much out of it. It was a little bit of an angle, but with the bevel gauge it's easy to transfer those angles onto any piece. I just hand sawed out the notches, and this was pretty simple work. So this bottom base here is one piece because this is open. You'll see this. I kind of wish I would have made the opposite side 2 pieces and another part of this one piece, because the opposite side will have drawers. You'll never see it. But the design for this changed, which you'll also see in this video a little bit, which was the reason why I kept that other piece a single piece. So then for parts, like I said, that you won't really see, I decided to use the saws. If there's a little bit of tear out, like I keep saying, pieces that will be covered with drawers, there's no sense of spending the extra 20 minutes or so to hand cut it if you'll never see it. So the blue tape, like I said, it does help, but it's not a full stop, especially since these are wide enough I have to cut them on both sides. Usually the bottom has more tear out than the top, but it will help a little bit. So that was the second bottom I did. Now I'm going to work on the tops. The tops are the parts I pieced together. This side I'm working on will be a lift out table, so you really only see the seams when the table's open, and the other one will be a less used lift out table as well as storage. So same thing, you're really only going to see the seams when they're lifted, so it wasn't worth it to spend an extra $100 so that these 2 pieces on this side could be seamless. Same process, you could see a little bit better on the top side with how I'm using the square to make my marks. I cut those out with a handsaw as well, and that was pretty self-explanatory. So this, like I said, this is the one you could tell that it has a slight angle to it, and that will transfer with the square. And once again, like I said, I hand cut all these out. Very quick work. Unfortunately, a lot of times I put the table on the piece and it doesn't look like the camera on the table, doesn't look like it's moving a lot in real time, but when you speed up these pieces it could be a little frustrating because it jumps around quite a bit. Now, one of the problems with furniture like this is this long run of boards. No matter what you do, sometimes they're just not going to be flat. So I did true it up a little bit when I put those cleats in there, but this has a little bit of bow on it, and that's one of the reasons why you have an overhang that hides all that sort of stuff. So that was just a close-up of the piece together side. You could see there's going to be a seam, but it's not going to be super visible, and I could just measure and cut these down. These 2 sides are almost identical in width and depth, so that was quite nice. My centerpiece I got almost exactly in the middle, which made life a little bit easier. So then at this point I sent some photos to the customer, because originally we were going to have a decorative panel in the front, 1 big side drawer on the side, and then 2 smaller ones on the other side. And as I was working on this, I kind of decided to ask her if she would mind if there were 2 decorative panels on the side and 3 identically sized drawers in the front. it was one of those nice circumstances where it would make my life a little bit easier. I think it would get her more storage because this is only about 10 inches. The opening is only about 10 inches. So with the hardware and everything, she would have only had about 2-inch deep drawers on that one side. So she agreed to do it, and I adjusted for that. If you're thinking of making stuff for people, that is a really good tip. These are I told you I swapped out the drywall screws for wood screws. So this is all getting glued together. I'm basically just disassembling it, adding glue, and then putting everything back together. But if you want to start making furniture for customers, I highly suggest taking photos as you go. It has saved me a lot of hassle catching things that I thought I was clear with a customer that they didn't quite understand, and you can make changes as you go versus making something the wrong way and then being surprised at the end. So that worked out really well, that I could adjust the design, send her a photo, and work off of that. So that is a little bit of a tip. If you want to start doing something like this for customers, it will save you a lot of headaches. So that was just gluing the laps into place, pretty self-explanatory. It's the same process as when I built it, I'm just adding glue. So for the top, I decided to make torsion boxes for all of my top panels for multiple reasons. It was going to be less expensive, it was going to be a little bit lighter, and they are so long. They're 5 foot long by about 2 foot deep. And they're only being held in place one side, on all sides, by hardware. So they're not going to be permanently attached to the aprons. And I knew if I used hardwood that they would just bow too much, and over time she would probably have a problem down the road. Torsion boxes are a time commitment, but I think it was well worth it for this project. It also gives me an excuse to use my vacuum press that I spent a lot of money on, and I haven't really used since I bought it for a project. And it's really just the proper way to do something like this. Like I said, making these tops out of hardwood, it would have been a hassle. The hardware, you would have had to make joints, expansion joints and all that to attach it. And using plywood. Plywood, I know people think it's really flat. It's not. It bows as well. So I basically went through and I'm making this in 3 sections. Obviously the 2 sections on either side. One of these sections will eventually get broken up into 2/3 and 1/3, but I thought it would be easier to just make it as one box and cut it later, which I think it was. But basically I just have tops and bottoms for all this stuff. For the tops, I'm using a solid piece without seams. For the bottoms, I have seams. And you'll see in the other video why the seams were a little bit of a problem. But I'm basically going to run through this process really quickly on the middle panel that I'm making. I have an outer edge and an inner edge because I'm using 3/4 inch oak to wrap around the entire piece. I wanted a solid edge with all these moving parts. I didn't want to do edge banding. I think it would just get chipped over time. So basically I'm going to have a 3/4 inch edge, so I accounted for that thickness when cutting this. And this 3/4 inch edge is going to go 1/4 inch into the torsion box. This will make more sense once it starts going together. The reason I'm going through this one quickly is because it's not how I build the other ones, because it's so skinny. I got away with just making a regular grid. I have a very large vacuum bag and a very large vacuum pump for a project, a very large dining table I made, I think a year or 2 ago. It's on the channel if you want to check out that project. So I was all set as far as that was concerned, and basically I'm just gluing this up. So this is just MDF with lap joints cut. You can see I made these verticals and the horizontals. I lined up the laps, gluing everything together. The other 2 pieces will have a complete grid network. Like I said, this one was small enough I only had to do a single layer of a grid, so it's a kind of extenuating circumstances for people making torsion boxes. I imagine most people will not be making super skinny ones like this, so I'm just going through it very quickly, yet you can still see the process. So I glued the laps together. I added glue to the underside, and then I can just put it on top of my piece. I have some pencil marks on there to kind of line everything up, and then I could glue together the top. This is basically a sandwich. It kind of mimics how an I-beam works. so that this will stay flat over time once it's all glued together. I really like this sort of construction for long flat tops that you want to stay straight forever. Plywood, solid wood will always move on you. MDF and this thin, especially this thin of plywood, is considered dimensionally stable. So if you do this properly, it will never be an issue popping up. I didn't want the lifts to have, if the wood started to bow on one corner or the other, they would come up off of the lifts, and I didn't want that to happen. So I let this set in the vacuum press overnight, and like I said, in the next video I get more in depth on how I made these, so I'm going through this pretty quickly. I could take it out the next day. There were no big gaps or anything in it. I was pretty happy with how this went. This process is not necessarily long to do, it's just there's a lot of drying time and setting up time in the press involved, so I could really only do one a day. So what I'm going to do to finish this up is I have an overhang on this because these have a tendency to want to move around in the vacuum press a little bit. So you do want an overhang on there. And I'm just going to trim up that overhang. I made sure to remove any glue residue that was on the side of these because the bearing on the router bit will hit that glue and make an uneven surface. But I just went around and routed the whole edge. You'll notice I start doing all the sides, but I quickly realized I only needed one side routed, and I could use that side on the fence and just cut the other side clear. So even though I start routing this all the way over, around about halfway through, I realized that was somewhat unnecessary, and I just cleaned up one side. So there is that one side. There's a couple little dimples in it from where I couldn't completely remove the glue. So I took a little hand plane and just cleaned up. You can see there's just like two little dimples in the front until it was pretty straight. And then this side I could run against my fence and automatically clean up that other side. I forget the exact dimensions on this because it wasn't really necessary. It was a certain dimension, but this is about a little less than 6 inches wide. And then, like I said, I could just clean up that one edge, send it through the saw. I believe I did flip this and send the other side through as well, but I don't think I filmed it. And then with a miter gauge, I could clean up the edges. I have a fine tooth blade in here, so it doesn't tear out any of the wood I have in there. So then this is what I'm left with. This is kind of the finished piece, and now I'm going to go through and prepare for adding the exterior trim. I didn't want to put butt joints on this, so what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to route a 1/4 inch out of the entire MDF central panel, and then I could put a tongue on my exterior oak and it will slide into place. This sounds complicated, but it's a pretty simple process. I just set it up so that that dado stack runs right through the middle of my piece. My oak's a little thicker than I need, so if this isn't perfect, it won't really matter. I was planning on making the oak oversized anyway, so if this groove isn't perfectly in the center, it's okay. You can account for that when you're making your tongues. And then I have a tenon jig that I use to make the end cuts a little bit less scary, and that is what I'm left with. So this groove is now the same around the entire perimeter of the piece. Like I said, it's about a 1/4 inch deep. That's basically what that looks like. You can see it only removed the MDF, it left the plywood in place. So like I said, I'm using 3/4 inch wide oak, but this is about 1 inch thick because it's 1/2 inch MDF and 2/4 inch oak panels. So I cut these about 1 inch and 1/16 just in case things were offline. But I made pencil marks for where the groove would be. I lined up that blade with the pencil mark. I'm going to send it through on one side, and I'm going to flip it upside down and turn it around, not flip it upside down, and cut it on the other side, and that will make my tongue groove. Now I knew I was doing this exact same groove on the other panels, so when I got all these measurements, I cut up a bunch of this red oak at once. So I had a whole stack of it, so when I had the torsion boxes done for the other panels, I wouldn't have to do this process again. You could see off camera I'm fitting it to make sure it fits. I think I had to make a couple minor adjustments to the dado stack, but then you could see with a hammer, I got it to fit in there nice in place. Not only will this be a nice solid edge, it's a nice solid joint. I don't have to worry about this popping out over time, and it gives a little bit more of a style to this central panel. So once I had that fit in place, like I said, I already had a bunch of this ripped to 1 1/16, and then I just sent it all through. You can see I sent it through on one side, spinning it around, and then sending it through again, creating that tongue. And then I'm going to miter all the corners to attach this stuff. So this looks like a big gap, but it's really a shadow because the one side was a little bit more proud than the other. But the way I do this is I just work around the box. I make one corner, I make marks, and I just work my way around all the sides. So that is what that looks like with the miters. This was just to avoid having end grain sticking out on the sides. I could snap this one in place and then cut for my next corner, snap that one in place and cut for my next corner. So that is that process. Everything fits in there nicely. You can see how the material is a little bit thicker than the panel, and that's okay. This stuff will sand down really easily and make one flush surface. And then I can just go around the whole piece, pop these off, and glue it together. And then I'm just going to clamp everything overnight. I was pretty happy with. I didn't know if this was going to work exactly how I wanted it to. That's also one of the reasons I made the central panel first. If it wasn't going to work, I can make adjustments for the other two sides, which were more important pieces. So this is kind of the mess I made of the glue up. I put a strap clamp across the length because I didn't have clamps long enough to hold those two miters across the length. And then you can see I started sanding this. This one side's nice and clean. You can just see how flat and perfect this is. And the next side, this stuff, because it's it's a small surface area to sand down. This went really fast with the belt sander. I think I had 80 grit in here, and then obviously I final sand everything at 120, but I didn't do that just yet. And then this is that final panel. So like I said, in the next video, I'm going to be showing you how I make the other two sides. I'll get much more in depth about the torsion box and how I went about making that. It is a little bit of a longer process, like I keep saying, but it's definitely worth it. I'll never have to worry about these panels moving, and especially when you're dealing with moving pieces, it's really important over time that all this stuff stays the way it is when you first build it.